Hey everybody, this is Luke with the MSU Deer Lab. So a couple weeks ago, we made a social media post about 7 of the most common oaks in the Southeastern United States and when they drop acorns relative to one another throughout the hunting season. So today we're gonna go over those 7 species identification based on leaves, acorns, and where they grow. So the first group of oaks that we're gonna talk about is the white oak group, and they generally drop earlier compared to the red oaks. And one way you can always tell white oaks from red oaks is bristle tips on the leaves. So white oaks on the tip of the lobes, they don't have any bristles, like little hairs extending off the tip of the leaf. They're not pointy, they're lobed. And eastern white oak, for example, this is a classic eastern white oak leaf, and you can see the sinuses going into the leaf margin are pretty deep and relatively uniform the whole way around. Now, eastern white oak acorns are a medium-sized acorn, ½ inch in diameter to maybe 3/4 of an inch, and the caps on white oak acorns are generally bumpy, whereas red oak acorns are scaly, like the shingles on a roof. And eastern white oak is pretty elastic, where it grows in bottomland areas, it grows in uplands, but it usually grows in drier sites in uplands. All right, so the second white oak we're gonna talk about is swamp chestnut oak. Now, any deer hunter who hunts bottomland hardwoods and hunts over acorns is going to recognize this leaf because white-tailed deer love these acorns in the early fall. So the leaf shape is much more uniform around the margin than with eastern white oak, and the lobes are much shallower. A swamp chestnut oak acorns are generally larger than eastern white oak acorns, sometimes 2 times as large, and the cap is much larger too. Cap's sometimes very bumpy, but it has mild scales, but not near like what you'll see with the red oak. Okay, so moving later into the hunting season is when the red oaks will generally start to drop. So we'll talk about willow oak and water oak at the same time because they grow in very similar places, generally bottomland hardwoods where there's wet soil, and their acorns look extremely similar. Now, acorns for these 2 species are generally about the size of a marble. They're pretty small, much smaller than the white oaks we just talked about. And so willow oak, this is a willow oak leaf right here. And you can see that the leaf is elongated and has a bristle tip right at the end of it. And it kind of looks like a black willow leaf if you're familiar with the willow, which is where it gets its name. So water oak, on the other hand, generally has lobes at the end of the leaf. And it can look anything like this one here in this hand where the lobes are more pronounced, or the lobes can be more dull and more rounded. So southern red oak is the first species we're talking about that you almost exclusively find in the uplands and dry soils. So this is a shade leaf for a southern red oak, and you can see the lobes are pretty dull, and it's almost like a mitten with 3 fingers sticking up here. And then this is a southern red oak leaf that you might find closer towards the canopy or in full sunlight, and the lobes are a lot more pronounced and longer, almost looks like a turkey foot. So again, these have bristle tips if you look very closely, and you can see that these are red oak. Now, southern red oak acorns are identical to cherry bark, which is our next species. They're medium-sized acorns with fairly shallow, scaly caps. Cherry bark oak is very elastic in where it grows, kind of like white oak is. You can find it in the bottomlands, you can find it in the uplands, but it tends to prefer the moisture soils in the bottomlands. Now, cherry bark and southern red oak actually used to be considered the same species, but there are a few key differences, mainly in leaf shape. So cherry bark oak has more lobes than southern red oak does, where southern red oak has usually 3 lobes, cherry bark will have anywhere between 5 and 9 lobes. Another key difference is the leaf base. The leaf base is more wedge-shaped, whereas in southern red oak, the leaf base is more U-shaped and much more gradual. So Shumard oak can be distinguished from some of the other red oaks by a couple key factors of the leaf. One is how deep the sinuses go. You can see the sinuses almost go the whole way to the mid-vein, and look at how many bristle tips there are. There's many, many bristle tips per lobe of the leaf. Shumard oaks grow in bottomland soils that are pretty moist and produce a very large acorn that is among one of the latest droppers of any of the oaks that we have listed, often extending into December or even January, mid to late winter. The last species we're going to talk about that is the latest dropper of all the ones we have listed is nuttall oak. Now, nuttall grows in very wet soils and is very commonly planted in wetland reserve programs, WRP if you're familiar with those, and it is extremely common in the Mississippi Delta. Now, nuttall oak and Shumard are pretty similar in terms of leaf shape, but Nuttall tends to have fewer bristle tips and fatter lobes, whereas Shumard has really deep lobes and they're more elongated. Now, one of the similarities between Nuttall oak and Shumard oak is that on the back side of the leaf, they have pretty noticeable clusters of little hairs where the veins intersect on the back of the leaf. And that's a really good ID for either one of these two species. Nuttall and Shumard oak acorns are generally pretty large, and they both sometimes have vertical stripes running up and down on the acorn. There's a couple of key takeaways here. One is that even though given a choice, deer may prefer white oak acorns over red oak acorns, white oak acorns are only available for a relatively short duration of the hunting season. Red oak acorns are available for a much longer portion of the hunting season, and deer still hammer them. Using the ID characteristics that we talked about, you can distinguish between the white oak group and the red oak group, and also among different species in each of the groups. Those unique tree characteristics for each species will help you determine which tree, which species you're looking at when you're in the woods, and when you should be targeting it to hunt based on its acorn drop timing. Thanks for watching, and be sure to follow along for more.